Thank you very much, Rita, for your kind words. I know Rita has a very good memory. You don't always remember, you'll remember just not only names, but also the links and the stuff that we are busy with. So you can never fool you in terms of trying to get away with some things. I would like now to introduce our Master of Ceremonies for the event, Ed Cortez. He's a longtime friend of mine. He was first in Madison, Ed, now he's in Tennessee. We share many things in common. We share humor in common. We share budget constraints in common. We share discussions on high schools in common. And we share international travel with IFLA and other events in common. We share an interest in Africa and other international issues in common. And it's just appropriate that you're here, Ed. Thank you for taking your time, also to fly out all the way, and be a key role player in our event today and tomorrow. Ed is now, although he looks very young, he's already more than 30 years in the profession. Is that correct? More than 30 years. He's currently the director of the School of Information Sciences in Tennessee. So I thought I was going to say he's not. That is the place where he is, because I was in South Carolina last week and I said, what are we doing here? But then he heated up a little bit here. He also taught in Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, Madison. And you've got a lot of research interest, Ed, amongst others, knowledge management, information retrieval, I assume organization of information, that's why you are here. You authored a number of monographs, publications, articles, and you also served on the ALA. I saw there's a lot of discussions now taking place on accreditation. I don't know if you've seen that. Discussion on ALA and accreditation of library science or library schools. You served on the Committee on Accreditation and on the Board of Regents of the National Library of Medicine. And Ed, the last word before I introduce you, I know that you've made a fundamental difference in our field, but more so in the lives of many students. So welcome, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannes. Master of Ceremonies makes me feel like I should be wearing a polyester tuxedo, sequins, patent leather shoes. Actually, I'm very fortunate to have these clothes on today. I'll tell you that my trip from Knoxville was somewhat uneventful, at least at the start of the trip. In fact, I got an upgrade, so I was very happy. Nice champagne coming in. Then I get to the airport, get my bag, get to the hotel, I start to unpack, and the first thing I pull out are these pink polka dot pajamas. And I thought, I don't remember having that pink polka dot. And I thought, I don't own pink polka dot pajamas. I had the wrong bag, so I had to get back into a cab, back to the airport, get my right bag, come back. So that's how my evening started in Milwaukee. In any event, I am thrilled to be here today. These folks and I go way back, and certainly the area of organization of information, as Hannes indicated, is somewhat of a passion of mine, even though I came late to it from a research perspective. Like many other sub-disciplines in the field of information studies, IO is plagued with many issues having to do with ethics. We have the issues of deprofessionalization versus outsourcing. There are issues relating to biases in description. There are a number of issues that you're going to hear about today, which I think are going to be very, very stimulating. Let me introduce our keynote speaker for this morning. Before being appointed to the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto, Professor Claire Beghtol held professional positions as Director of Research at Ketchum Canadian Incorporated and as Chief Cataloger Indexer for the journal CBC TV. She was president from 1998 to 2002 of the International Society of Knowledge Organization and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Knowledge Organization from 1998 to 99. She's active in ACES, where she served as chair of the Classification Research Special Interest Group and other capacities. Her publications include articles in the Journal of American Society for Information Science and Technology, Knowledge Organization, Library Resources and Technical Services, the Journal of Documentation, and Libra, among others. Of particular relevance to today's talk are two articles that she published, one in 2005 entitled Ethical Decision-Making for Knowledge Representation in Organization Systems for Global Use. That appeared in the JASIS Journal. In 2002, she published the paper, A Proposed Ethical Warrant for Global Knowledge Representation in Organization Systems, and that appeared in the Journal of Documentation. Her book, The Classification of Fiction, The Development of System Based on Theoretical Principles, was published in 1994. Her research interests include classification theory, structural principles of methods of organization, the organization of knowledge, domain analysis, hierarchical and faceted classification systems, relationships and subject access systems, and the linguistic cognitive basis for knowledge organization system. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Claire Beghtol.
Thank you very much. How's this? I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to be part of the first, and I think it is the first conference of this type, at least in North America. And I want to thank everybody who's already been thanked, and do that again, so you can take that as written. I think these questions are very important for the next generation of information organization. My plan today is not to give you any answers but only to raise questions, and I hope to encourage you to stop me whenever you want to ask a question, make a comment, or complain, or whatever it is. We have a generous amount of time, and I hope we can use it well. Thanks. In general, the ethics of information organization falls into the area of applied ethics, as you know, which attempts to deal with specific realms of human action and to craft criteria for discussion of issues that arise within the profession or the area of action. Various professional organizations like IFLA and ALA and all the other ones all have ethical codes. We may not have read those, but I have, and I can assure you that every one of them talks about unhindered access to information for every individual. So that's really a kind of theme that I'm going to be talking about today, access for the individual. The point of departure for this talk is the differences, the cultural ones and the linguistic ones and every other kind, assumed by different knowledge organization systems and theories from the beginning in North America to now. And to contrast what happened in the past to what we now face. In the late 19th century, Charles Cutter and Melville Dewey could reasonably assume that there was a certain amount of homogeneity of, quote, users in libraries. They could assume that these were English-speaking Americans, relatively well-educated, who were using the library catalog in an open-shelf library and searching for bibliographic records, which would lead them, if they were successful, to the documents they wanted. By the mid-20th century, researchers and practitioners were beginning to talk about the user in the sense of a much larger group, not a local library group necessarily. Access to the catalogs or databases at that time could either be manual or mechanical, or sometimes electronic. But you had to go to someplace else. I mean, you couldn't do this from your home. You had to go to a library or to an archives or to a hospital, maybe to access the records and then to get the documents. Throughout this period, it was never assumed that you were doing this at home or at any place other than an institution of some description. It's possible that some people had purchased printed indexes, but as you know, some of those are enormous. The National Union Catalog and things like that is not what you want to fill up your house with. Now we need to talk about a user who might do any of these things from their home. And they might be talking about or looking for information and any kind of information from their home or from their place of work. And they might be, in some cases, using their place of work as a jumping off point for leisure activities, as we know. Now you can even use a cell phone for this. You don't even need to have a computer in that sense. They could be adults or children or medical professionals. They could be scholars, or they could just be someone who's interested in a certain hobby. The ethical implications of the shift from users as a group to a user about whom no assumptions can be made about anything, about their language, about their time, their place, or where they are, or even where they are in time as things go on, are profound. We can't assume any kind of homogeneous group, nor can we assume that information providers are interested in ethics, in the ethical implications of all their. In this situation, we need to emphasize the changes that have taken place over these 100 years, not only through computerization, but also through the evolution of ideas about how to accomplish the heterogeneous information and knowledge seekers that exist now. We no longer have the luxury of assuming that a user of an information organization system comes from any particular time or place. Our task now is to make all the world's information accessible to one person according to what they need at that moment. To talk about this problem, I want to start from the beginning, and I'm going to use many, many examples to illustrate of the kinds of problems that we need to solve. Some of the examples are humorous, I think, but I can assure you they all raise serious questions about ethics for information, organization, and retrieval. As you can see from the outline, my discussion today is going to be at a fairly high level of generality. We need to think about the varied kinds of context in which information may occur, the varied perspectives of information searchers, the differences of cultural awareness and cultural competence that they make for ethical information organization and information seekers. In addition, the concept of cultural hospitality can help us focus on the ethical problems of individuals, groups, and cultures. Finally, I want to emphasize, in Robert Fairthorn's phrase, the classificatory gaze. The classificatory gaze is the perspective that each individual brings to the idea of knowledge or information organization. Now, let's start with information and context. In general, the goal of information organization is to create order from chaos. This slide shows how to change the word chaos to the word order, should you want to do that. And it was part of an ad for an all-new radio station in Toronto a while back. What's interesting about this is not the words themselves and how they've been made to change, but the background. The stars and black space that exist outside of any order that we can create. In fact, we can create any number of orders from chaos. When we do that, however, some chaos still exists in the background, and it stays there. It's probably the remaining background space that I want to emphasize today, the things that don't really fit very well. Information is always in a context. The issues that it brings up are complex. Whether it's a context of one searcher, the context of a question, the context of history in some way, or the context of a certain information organization system. There is no naked information. There is always a context. We don't always, sometimes we don't notice that, but in fact, that's the case. Because it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in our minds and our needs. Depends on who wants it, what the person wants it for, and where it might be found. And of course, people being what they are, individuals always have different ideas from each other about what is information, and what's the context, and what is the appropriate context in which to view information. Another way to express this idea is to distinguish between information and non-information, or information and nonsense. As you know, information is what we want to know or find out, but what is nonsense may change over time. I'm sure we've all done database searching or web searching or something and retrieved nonsense. But if we think about that in another context for another person, what was nonsense may now turn into information for somebody else. It might be useful information, or it might be wrong information. But what is nonsense to someone might be perfectly good for someone else. Presently, information technology has allowed information and knowledge to become globally available at any time or any place, from many times and many places. Simultaneously, as you know, new developments have narrowed the focus of information to the highly personalized worlds of Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and all of those kinds of sites and ways of contacting other people. Historically, we've thought about information organization in terms of groups of various kinds of users who are searching in some domain, and they know what the domain is. For some reason, dealing with their work or their leisure activities or some other thing that impacts on their life. Any group of individuals is, of course, more or less homogeneous, but we've assumed that they have perspectives that are similar enough to make our information organization systems useful and relevant to their endeavors. Now, our problem is to create, with information organization systems, a way of accounting for individual differences heterogeneous views of information, views of what they're searching for. We also need to keep in mind, of course, the very much larger amount of information that is available to each one of us daily at every moment. These are commonplace observations, and I'm sure it's nothing you haven't heard before. But they're not often dealt with in very much detail or with examples. That's one of the things I want to, I would like you to take away from this talk, is that there are specific difficulties raised by the difference between globalized information and personalized information, and we have to deal with both of them. How can we organize information in such a way to fulfill the ethical criterion of unhindered access for individuals? So I want to turn now to individuals and their perspective. And to start with the very contrast that I've been talking about. The tension between public categories and personal categories. In the video store, Ralph Dracula looks around, he can't find anything because he's only interested in movies with pie fights or movies with monkeys in them. Those are his personal categories. And when any one of us goes to the video store, we might not want those categories, but we also might not want the categories that are laid out in the first picture. So we need to be able to deal with the very broad categories over there and the very narrow categories that Ralph has in mind. Here, the broad categories that are assumed to be useful for everyone are familiar, but they're not useful for a specific individual who is only interested in particular kinds of movies. We could put each of ourselves in the place of Ralph and choose our own categories, probably not Ralph's, but our personal choices might not necessarily coincide with the public categories. And in fact, I can almost guarantee that they would not. Looking at this problem from the other direction, how appropriate are these for public categories? If you're going to go and buy a car. These categories might be what someone is thinking about when they go to find a car. But sarcasm is not the usual public category. Hope you're happy now. So this side contrasts the real message you would like to send with the message that is actually probably on the inside of the car in a normal situation. So how appropriate are the public categories to what we personally want? We can also look at hierarchies from a different perspective. This is a corporate organizational chart, and you see it's for this week. And it's somewhat upside down, sort of standing on its head. And this person at the bottom, me, is holding up this vast network of the whole corporation with categories and groups that you've probably never heard of and never want to. We can look at this chart as an analog of the world of information weighing down an individual. This poor soul is equally overwhelmed by the corporation and by the world of information. Here the hierarchy is standing upside down, and the individual is bearing its entire weight. Further, we can assume that this individual, me, is contemporaneous with and also descended from multiple generations of people, each of whom had his or her own ideas and questions and information they would like to know. These also converge, these generations also converge on this individual and influence his or her decision about how to deal with the corporation. It's not that easy. We can also look at this from another point of view. This is a total descent chart for the. This is a total descent chart, for the Prince of Wales, who is in the middle, and it goes back 7 generations on both sides of the family. This is another way of viewing a hierarchy that is often thought of as the family tree. The Prince of Wales is in the center, and all the generations on both sides are arranged around the center. Multiple generations converge on one individual who now bears the burden of being descended from all these previous generations, somewhat like converging on me in the bottom of the hierarchy, the other hierarchy. Each one of us has a total descent chart. Although you might not know, I mean you do, you might not know very far back. And each of us carries with him or her their cultural history, their family history, the ideas of all the people who came before them. And we also inherit their ideas about information, about research, and about knowledge. Sometimes we reject those things, but not always in us. So if we need to contrast this, the individual bearing all these problems, with problems of grouping, we can do that. We're not only dealing with one person when we deal with information, usually. We're trying to make groups. And in making groups, we find there are common problems. The groups that we make, the categories are not always appropriate for everybody. Categories are not necessarily jointly exhaustive and mutually exclusive as the traditional criteria for knowledge organization would have us believe. Categories can be fuzzy, and the organizing principles may not be obvious. So I have an example here, and I want you to join with me to look at the problems of groups. This is an example about a kitchen chair and its friend. So what do you think is the organizing principle of this group?
Furniture, put stuff on.
Yes, that could be. Anything else? There could be more than one principle of grouping. They all have legs. Sort of. Well, a television set. That's true. Okay, so they're all the types of furniture. They're things you can put things on. They have legs or not, as the case may be. Some desks don't have legs and some have feet, as has been pointed out. How about this? Things you can sit on. So now we have the kitchen chairs in a completely different group. What's the organizing principle here?
Things with legs.
That's right, things with legs. Now, we don't often think, I don't think I've ever been to a database and said, give me things with legs. Probably never will. But the principle of putting things in groups that they don't obviously belong to is a sound one. Kitchen chair, a book, a computer, a chandelier, a cat, a mouse, 3 kinds of mice.
Things in one particular room.
Yeah, I think it's really spatial. Things that would come in one room. And this calls attention to the ambiguity of language because we have a real mouse, a toy mouse, and a mouse like that. And we have one more. Kitchen chair, stretcher, obus form, wall, ironing board, and a door frame.
What's an obus?
It's one of those things that you put behind your back.
Is it rectangular? Something you can sit against? Support structures.
Yeah, support structures or, things that if you don't have a great back, might be useful for you at one point or another. So I hope to have demonstrated here that it's not necessary. If somebody says kitchen chair, you may just think, oh yeah, kitchen chair. But it actually could belong to a number of groups, which may or may not be obvious to you, and you may or may not ever want to retrieve. Now, we can move from this to another example of overlapping categories. This is a Swiss Army turtle. Usually, each one of these creatures lives in its own group of creatures of its own species, has its own home, its own source of food, and its own life. Here, they're all mixed up in a turtle. And they don't look too happy about it. You can see that the rat is having a look at the snake and wondering the rabbit is looking at the bear and maybe not. The Swiss Army turtle is analogous to the situation in which we find ourselves today. Very different individuals from very different groups are all locked in to the global information world. And the job of information organizations is to create an ethical environment in which all these different creatures get along, and in which each one, the need that each one has for information, their perspective is preserved. So you can see when you look at it from this point of view that it's quite difficult. What if somebody wanted to retrieve this cartoon? How could we do that? Is there anything that we could do that would help? And I'm not answering the question. I'm leaving that for you to answer through this conference. Our problem is to create an ethical situation for all these creatures at once and then allow the cartoon to be retrieved. Let's turn to culture. Many of the groups that people are joined are what we can call cultures. The concept of culture exists in many different disciplines. And there are many definitions of culture. Usually refers to shared values, shared history, language, collective memory, social preferences, and practices. Cultures can conform to national boundaries, but ethnic cultures can transcend national boundaries, the geographic boundaries of many countries. I come from Toronto, and Toronto has the largest concentration of Italian-born people outside Italy in the world. So people in Toronto have to be very aware of Italian people. Added to that complication is that people can belong, and you may all do this, belong to one culture. You were born in one country, you may live now in another, you may have citizenship in several countries. You may belong to a certain religion which crosses boundaries. Or to a political party, which would also cross boundaries, you may belong to some kind of a group that likes to play the same games or read the same kinds of books or something like that. And the other issue I'd like to bring up is that cultures change over time. Cultures are not static, they change. And the people in a culture care about the culture a lot, but they can disagree about the culture and how it's changing and how it's moving forward, or in some cases the way people think it's moving backward. So we need to be aware of these issues to create inclusive information systems. And in my view, as you may have gathered, I think it's important to use the most complicated examples that we can find. Because if we can deal with complicated examples, like the Swiss Army drill, we may have found a method of dealing with the other problems, what seem to be simpler problems. Here's an example of I forgot that slide, sorry. Here's an example of a change in a professional culture, in which the old-fashioned reference librarian is now a search engine who sits at a desk in the same way as usual, but now can give access to the catalog and to the entire world of globalized information, and is, in this case, calling herself a search engine to sort of get into trendy stuff. This change has happened just as quickly as the change from the card catalog to the web catalog. And it's had, obviously, significant meaning. As we know, this kind of culture change raises many new questions. And we can agree or disagree on the answers to those questions and still belong to the culture of the professional librarian. In a broader sense, we can compare natural languages in the conceptual space that occurs in different natural languages. Here are 4 European languages compared to English on the left. As you can see, they divide up the conceptual space differently. And those of you who speak more than one language it will be obvious. And in fact, it's obvious to all of us. We just don't think about it very often. Automatic translation systems have made great strides fairly recently, but many of us can remember the first computer translation systems that tried to translate between Shakespearean English and modern English, or from the Bible to modern English. That's very hard to do. That's a simple example. But now I want to turn to talk about color. This is our modern way of looking at color. The horizontal axis deals with the brightness of the color, and the vertical axis is the hue, or the color. We know that light creates a spectrum of colors, like a rainbow, and in a rainbow, the different colors are not rigidly divided. People, like rainbows, do not rigidly divide colors. And I would like to now contrast Old English with modern English as far as the conceptual spaces of colors. And I'm going to do this by reading to you from a scholar who studies this and what problems this kind of thing creates. She talks about the kind of problem. Okay. Our own modern English color classification is fairly biased toward the differentiation of hues. So much so, in fact, that we even term extremely light surfaces white and extremely dark surfaces black and treat them as hues. Similarly, we reserve the noun category for their designation and use pale and dark as adjectival qualities to express the brightness dimension. Hue names are thus the fixed points on which we hang our whole color system. Once we appreciate how lopsided and idiosyncratic is our own color system, we shall not be surprised to find that the Anglo-Saxon approach to color was quite different, and that attempts to treat the latter as a hue-stressing system have resulted in a rare confusion. You have to know Old English in order to realize this. The main stress of the Old English color classification falls firstly not upon hue, but upon brightness. And here's the color classifications compared, modern English and Old English. And you can see that they look at color in the same way. And that if I said in Old English, the sky is red, that could conceivably be translated as the sky is yellow, which would certainly have a very different connotation. These purport to be the same language. But even so, if we don't translate them correctly, it's analogous to, it would be analogous to talking about temperature without telling the people whether the unit of measurement was Fahrenheit or Celsius, or talking about the dollar without telling people whether you were talking about the American dollar or the Canadian dollar or one of the other currencies that uses the word dollar. This is an example of the influence of culture, and we need to understand each one. Each culture has repercussions in our daily lives, and it's sometimes hard to recognize that because culture is invisible. We just think it's obvious very often. This brings up the issue of cultural competence. Cultural competence is a growing area of library practice, recently defined as highly developed ability to understanding and knowledge about culture and its practices over time. It's studied highly in other areas such as psychology or education, health issues, but we're just getting to it in LIS. I think that we need to study the cultural competence and its various areas. It's much more complex than I'm telling you today, but I think it's a helpful concept in expressing what we need to have in order to create ethical IO systems. Here's an example, a sort of negative example of cultural competence in profession. And I put this here, Kathy. No, that's the doomed pile. New mail goes in this little pile that I can still deal with. 1 week old mail in this little pile. The doomed pile is for things that I've ignored, avoided, rationalized, and hidden from for so long that I can't even look at them without getting sick. If you're never going to do that stuff, why don't you just throw it away? It would seem so unprofessional. Now, Kathy strives to be a professional. She wants to be a kind of perfectionist, but she doesn't have the idea of what a professional is or does. And so she's trying to work her way around to some kind of professional competence without guidance. She's missing the point. Okay, plenty of time. So let's look at another example of professional competence. This is academic cultural competence. And I want to ask you these questions. How do you organize your course materials for your courses? If you're a student, however many courses you have, or a teacher, how do you organize your materials. You don't organize this. You just throw it all in a pile and hold it. Sorry?
There is that.
Any other possibilities?
From simple to complex.
Okay, from simple to complex. Say you're taking 4 courses, what would you do?
Organize my class.
Okay, I would say organize my class.
Course.
Course, yeah. So, and within that organization, what would you do? Do you divide those?
Chronologically. Separate folder for each week.
Folder for each week. Okay, or chronologically or by deadline. By deadline would be for assignments. Does anybody do it differently? Okay. I mean, there's no right way. You can do it any way you want. Alphabetically, it's suggested to me that you would take the first word on each page and then file it alphabetically. Yes.
I organize by type of assignment,
Okay.
smaller little exercises, papers.
Okay, but all within one course. Yeah.
Can you repeat that, please?
She organizes like a little assignment and big assignments within one course. Does anyone take all the assignments and do them chronologically so they know what's coming next? That's been suggested as a very good way of doing it, but not very many people have ever thought of it, and I never thought of it when I was a student. Why do you do this? For retrieval. Same thing. Why do you organize it? Generally, people organize it by course. Why do you do that?
To make some own order of it in your mind.
Yes, it helps you remember, and your own order happens in your mind. So you can find it.
I think there's a presumption that material from any given course has more in common with other material from that course than it has with material from any other course. That the courses are kind of self-contained, and there might be overlap, but not as much overlap as there is lack of overlap. That's how I thought that.
On a larger scale, why do you do this?
Because of the groups of people that we're dealing with. I mean, so each course has a certain group of people that's associated. So you organize the materials to assist in the work of people, not that. So the question is, are you organizing for the material, or are you organizing for the folks that are actually involved with the material? That would be.
Yes, that would be one principle on which you could divide that. Yes.
I don't teach classes, but what I would think is because each course is essentially a discrete unit of information that's judged by the university and the department as being discrete in totality in and of itself. And we organize it that way because that's how we're accountable.
Yes, that's basically, I mean, there are a lot of different answers, yes.
The question is why do we organize it all? Because we're human beings.
Well, that's very true. But I'd also like to suggest that we organize it by course, because that's the way the university is organized, which is what you said. Why is the university organized that way? Is every university in the entire world organized by course? Or are there other principles? I don't really know the answer to that, but I suspect it's not the case. We try to make things easy for ourselves by taking, the university tells me this is a discrete course, so I'm going to treat it as discrete, even though I'm aware of many overlapping issues between all the courses that I'm taking. But we don't organize thematically, say by subject. We could separate all the courses, and we could say, okay, these are user issues, these are retrieval issues, these are social issues, and mix all the courses up. But then when you had to study for a test, you would have to reorganize it again so that the fact that it was a discrete course within the university that you had to have a test in would all be brought back together. And that's a way of cultural competence. You know the university is divided into courses, and you want to do the same thing because it makes it easier for you. It makes more sense to you. It's a simple example. One of the things that it calls to mind is that how difficult it is to figure out why you are doing something. It's cultural. You know that. The university is organized in courses, so of course I'll have a binder for each course, and within that I'll have notes maybe every week or class notes in one place, something like that. And so you're academically, culturally competent. And someone who would just take every piece of paper and throw it in the pile, we know is going to have a really tough time. Here's another problem. I'm throwing a lot of problems. There's a centaur that the vet told me to come and see you. Now, who has a cultural competence problem?
Depends on the context.
Yes. And you know, what context would, in what context would who have a problem?
Well, in the context of a world where there's only one centaur, the centaur has the problem. But in the context of a world where humans and the centaurs have similar populations, then I guess they both have a problem.
Yes.
And in a context of the world of mostly centaurs, the doctor has a problem.
Well, in the context of a world of mostly centaurs, presumably there would be some medical profession that dealt with mixed biodiversity issues, call it. We don't really have that problem now, as you may be aware. And but you never know. Cloning is coming along at a private rate, and it may be that sometime we will have to deal with this kind of problem. And we might have many creatures, maybe not quite to the extent of that turtle, but here's only two. And either the vet, we don't have a category for something that falls in between a vet and a human doctor, because we don't need one. So here's a question of cultural competence for the centaur, because who is living, the cartoon implies, in a world of people. But if we were a person then, living in a world of centaurs, we would probably have a cultural competence problem. This brings up for me the issue of cultural hospitality. One aspect of cultural competence for ethical information organization is the concept of cultural hospitality. Ethical information organization requires that the cultures of user populations be respected, that we need to make provisions for allowing diverse cultures to be brought into information systems, and that individual users should be able to choose different perspectives according to the need of the moment, and according to which of the various cultures you belong to, you need to satisfy at the moment. This is not easy. This is an example of the normal or the usual kind of hospitality that we think of in organizational systems. so we need to solve different problems. Sorry about that. Star that gave too much. Some stars take and some give. Then there's the tortured relationship of E.F. Eridanus, where the smaller of two stars gave so much to the larger companion that it reached dead end. And scientists said yesterday they haven't seen anything like it. Doomed to orbit its more energetic partner for millions of years, the burned out star has lost so much mass that it can no longer sustain nuclear fusion and has become a new indeterminate stellar object. The donor star has reached a dead end. It's far too massive to be considered a superplanet, and it's too low in mass to be a star, said astronomer Steve Howell. There's no true category for an object in such limbo. I learned that there were stars and planets. It never occurred to me, until I read this, that there was something in between stars and planets. And we would have to have, in our information organization systems, some way of dealing with this indeterminate object. I tried to find out whether we now have a category for that, and I couldn't do it. So you'll forgive me, but that's something you can try yourself. Now let's look at the changes wrought by time. This is the organization and spatial arrangement of the Glasgow Lunatic Asylum in 1807. It's a kind of double hierarchy, which you can read either from the right or from the left. The right hand, the male patients are on the right hand, but the female patients are on the left hand of the wing. Both genders were divided into two social classes of the higher rank. Those are nobility and people who could pay. And in the lower rank, those are people who could not pay. They live in different places. This is extremely symmetrical, as you can see. And each group has 4 probable things that can go wrong. They can be frantic, incurable, convalescent, or in an ordinary state. Well, that's a little confusing. Frantic, okay, that's how the person is behaving. Incurable, hopeless. Convalescent, getting better. And in an ordinary state. What's that mean in this context? Presumably it means something between convalescent and cured. Or sorry, between incurable and convalescent. But that's a huge area. And those people are all living together on a second story. This is instructive because it shows only 200 and a bit years ago in Glasgow, they had completely different ideas about these things. For one thing, we would never call it a lunatic asylum. And the categories that we would use would be also very, very different. This is pre-Freud, it's pre-pharmacology, it's pre-everything that we take for granted. It demonstrates some things about how cultures change over time, and it provides an example of ethical information organization. Now, we wouldn't expect it to be called a lunatic asylum, and we would recognize considerably different mental states for these people. We had a student psychiatrist. I mean, he was a psychiatrist who became an information student, and I showed this. And he said, oh, they're so under control. I mean, they're so afraid of these people. They just want it so symmetrical and so beautifully arranged. And I thought, well, maybe that's true. We don't know what they thought. We don't know how to find out what they thought unless we look at a diagram like this. Okay. Actually, I'm almost done. Here's another example, which is perhaps closer to home. Beans. We all know what beans are. This is from a 1966 article about the categories of beans that Beghtol or people of Mexico divided beans, and what is considered to be the Western botanical classification in their various languages. So you don't need to know in either of these languages to know which classification is considered correct. Do you? You don't have to know anything about beans. I don't. But we can see that the labels given these groups tell us something about what this author thought. Didn't like the Beghtol's very much. They under-differentiated this one group and they over-differentiated another group. And we can fix that quite easily by changing the labels. The Beghtol has less differentiation for some beans and more for some other beans. And we still don't need to know the language. But we would have to think about whether the Beghtol people didn't have as many kinds of beans of this variety, or whether here it was culturally important for these particular kinds of beans to be differentiated. So it shows the importance of recognizing cultural warrant and the cultural influence of how we group things. And here's the classificatory gaze. You may recognize this, it was a 1975 cover from the New Yorker magazine called The View from 9th Avenue. Here's 9th Avenue, really big to 10th Avenue, and everything else pretty much vanishes. Because the perspective is very different. I live in Canada now, which you can almost see over here. I was actually born in Nebraska, which you can almost see in the middle. But from 9th Avenue, it's nowhere. I think this is a very striking way of looking at a different perspective that you bring to everything we look at. We all look at it differently. We would all like to, or if we had the choice, we would like to probably organize the world differently. We've moved from a world in which users could be considered somewhat the same to one in which each individual is a user with particular needs and ways of looking at information. What can we contribute to both ends of the spectrum, the group and the individual? Can we bring our knowledge of the extremes to bear on each other in some ways? What criteria can we establish for creating information organization systems that address both globalization and the personalization of information and knowledge? These are ethically significant questions, and they need serious debate and research. The first step is probably agreeing on the questions, because it's better to agree on the questions before you answer. At least it's better to have a question before you create an answer. I don't have the answers, and I think the next generation of people who come to make these studies, many of whom are in this room, will be the ones to solve these problems. This kind of conference is a first and important step in making these ideas come into general use. And I'm finished. Thank you very much.
We have time for a couple of questions.
I mean, I thought it was cool.
Question for Claire. I guess I have. Go ahead, please.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask that Related Civilians writes and talks about aboutness. We know about the notion of relevance. Is much of what you shared with us fall into those two categories of relevance and aboutness?
Well, yes. I think they're not related. But as I said before, I think the more complicated the question, or the more complicated the example, the more likely we are to be able to end up having something that will be relevant to the whole, all the other examples. So that would be relevant. I'm not sure about this. But of course, as you know, when you research of some kind, what you think something is about is not always what everybody else thinks it's about, and we can certainly see that in the subject cataloging. So every time you look at a subject heading, you go, why? You know, have the student say, why is this the subject heading? This book is not about this. So yes, I think they're relevant to both of those issues.
Yes, there's a question back here.
Right. I wanted to go back to the beginning of your talk. You were talking about the shift to the librarian as the search engine. One of the things I wonder about how, when we talk about information organization, when I went to library school, it was an organization, knowledge would come down a few pegs. But the idea, I think, with the origins of information organization was that it was seen as a mediated process. And what's actually happening is we're moving into an unmediated process and expecting the systems that we develop to support one mediation to now support something else. And I'm wondering if there is an issue there, as we believe we can move out of the mediated process into that. Is that actually possible?
Well, that's a question for the future. I think that the unmediated process is sometimes successful in some kinds of things. Research usually shows that, although it shows a lot of things, usually shows that completely unmediated is not as successful because the questions are more complex than the categories that people put things in by themselves. On the other hand, the criticisms of something like LCSH is that you get these long, maybe a 10-stage heading, which is so complicated that in fact nobody will find it. So I think in the end we're going to have some kind of melding of the two, mediated and unmediated in some way. Democratic indexing is something that's been around for a long time. Now we have the taxonomies and the things like that. People putting their own categories. I think it's in the future, it somehow will be joined. There will be some way of doing both. But speculating is not really, probably what you want. Anybody else?
Thank you very much. It's been suggested that we take a break now, 15-minute break, and then come back and listen to our two speakers before lunch. So we'll take a 15-minute break and be back at 10:45.